We gotta spread this stuff around. Let's put it on the internet.
You're listening to Binnall of America Audio.
Great heavens! What kind of radio show is this?
To move on a little bit here, I want to talk about what I found to be some interesting trends or maybe just interesting characteristics of the Yowie that I had never really heard about as far as an American Bigfoot. These, sort of maybe it even indicates that they're the same kind of animal but a different species or something. I'm not sure, but there were sort of different aspects to the Yowie that I was unfamiliar with and had not heard stand out in American cryptozoology. One of them I wanted to ask about was that the Aborigines said that the Yowie seemed to arrive after long periods of wet and stormy weather. Would you say that sort of holds up over the course of some of your case reports?
Yes and no. We did a statistical analysis as best we could with our 300 or so reports, and no, we couldn't find anything to suggest that Yowies are seen more in stormy weather than not. However, there are some cases that you think, there are some individual cases where, for instance, a small village down the south coast, not too far from where I am, where I've been many times, they've seen Yowies there repeatedly, and white people and Aborigines there both have said to me that these things, they said you should come back in the middle of a really, really rainy period. That's when these things turn up. They come out of the deep forest and we're able to see them in the village or on the edge of the village. I interviewed an Aboriginal elder from northwest Western Australia, way the heck over there, one time, and he said that his people believe that the hairy man, I forget the local term they use, Jingara, I think, over there, the Jingara is seen in stormy weather, really stormy weather. We have a case that was dug up by Graham Joyner years ago of Yowie being seen in the Tinderley Mountains just south of here, and the reporter said all the local people here say that these things are seen in stormy weather. That was white pioneers. So. And then there are a couple of other ones. So I think, personally, there may be something to this, but our database is just not extensive enough. And by the way, there are one at least, Bigfoot report that I know that seems to hint, possibly at this. There was a woman who saw one in Colorado not so long ago, and a big storm had just passed over when she saw hers. Anyway, I don't know. Perhaps we'll investigate that further.
And then another one of these aspects was this interest in children, sort of an interest in human children from the Yowie. What about that? Yeah. That sort of weird trend.
Yes, well, that's pretty much the same. The Aborigines in some areas certainly say that. One of the Aboriginal elders that Neil Frost got in touch with when he was trying to make sense of what was happening in the Blue Mountains, he immediately said, do you have children in your house? And Neil said, yes, we do. At that time, their kids were about 2 and 4 years old. And the little kids had seen one. And Neil said, why? And the guy said, well, they seem to be fascinated by children, or they have an interest in children. Of course, this frightened Neil. He thought, oh, my God, were they going to run off with the kids or something? The guy said, oh, not necessarily, but there is some kind of affinity or something like that. And I've heard that from Aboriginal people myself. In some of the earlier reports from the 1930s, or dating back into the stories that were collected in the colonial era, Aborigines seem to be saying that sometimes children will be taken away and eaten by these things. So I just don't know, but that's the sort of anecdotal stuff I've heard and tribal beliefs. But once again, in our statistical analysis, for what it's worth, we haven't been able to establish that. I mean, certainly plenty of cases where children have been involved, but many more cases where men and women were involved.
Yeah, maybe I should have not called them trends instead of called them, I don't know, strange characteristics.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's worth mentioning for sure, absolutely. I mean, wasn't it true with the Zunaqua or in British Columbia, they used to call the Sasquatch the cannibal woman or something like that? There was some similar belief that they might run off with children.
Perhaps. I'm not as well versed in Bigfoot as I used to be, I guess.
There's
some of
a lot
these
to keep up with now, yeah.
Yeah. And another one of these weird characteristics that I'm sure you'll have a lot to say about is the biting of the trees. This strange trend or characteristic of trees being bitten into and grubs being taken out, and no discernible animal could be doing it possibly except for a bird, and that doesn't really make any sense either. And people think it is the Yowie because it's in Yowie country. Talk about this biting of the trees situation.
Yes, that's an interesting one. It's rather problematic because some Yowie researchers say no, we don't believe it, but others take it very seriously. Yes, it's in some of these Yowie hotspots, people have noticed that saplings, perhaps 4 inches in diameter, 4 to 6 inches in diameter or smaller, have been bitten by something that was quite evidently looking for wood-boring grubs. There's usually an indentation where a large grub had been right in the middle of this bite and the grub has been removed. Well, something would need to have awfully strong jaws to do that. Nobody's seen a Yowie doing it, but people like the Frost swear that these bites have appeared overnight right on the edge of their property. And the only other candidate for making bites like that is the black cockatoo, which is a large bird with very strong beak, and they make very similar marks, usually a lot messier though, and often extending from ground level right up to way above head height, different kind of marks, sometimes very similar to these, quote, Yowie bites. But the bites that Neil Frost and others considered to be suspicious are always between about 4 feet and 6 to 7 feet from the ground. And they're spaced out along pathways between, well, not particularly well-marked pathways, but game trails between areas where Yowies are seen frequently in the Blue Mountains. So Neil and an outdoor educator, fellow Pat Ryan, plotted many of these tree bites using GPS and found that they ran out along areas, pathways connecting some of these Yowie hotspots. It does appear, you know, I'm inclined to believe that these bites are made by Yowies, but it's an area where if you told an Australian naturalist who was sceptical about Yowies, about these bites, he would say, forget it, they're just made by black cockatoos and that's that. But it's not quite that simple. One very experienced naturalist, Gary Opert, who probably knows more about Australian animals than virtually anyone, he's examined these bites, and he says no, they aren't black cockatoo bites. They are discernibly different. So yes, it's an odd one, but until someone actually sees a yowie biting one of these trees, I don't know.
Yeah. And the other interesting yowie trend characteristic that I want to talk about, which you alluded to earlier, of course, is the feet of clay, as you and Paul call it in the book. This bizarre foot situation where, despite all these great reports on the yowie, there seems to be no consensus on the situation with the foot, which is ironic in a sense because the American Bigfoot is famous for the foot. But the yowie is like the opposite, where we can't get a real bead on what's going on with the yowie feet. So talk a little bit about the yowie foot.
Yes, it's very strange, this Aborigines who, in the tribal era particularly, and even today in many areas, they're fantastic trackers and woodsmen, seem to be rather vague about the shape of the yowie foot. I mean, they're quite unanimous about the general physical shape of the big hairy man. But the foot, well, in Cape York, up that way, they talk about the creatures having 3 toes with claws on the toes. Well, that seems strange because no primate, as far as we know, has 3 toes. Further south, well, I've talked to Aborigines who say, well, the tracks were like human tracks, only bigger. Well, that implies 5 toes. The implication in many Aboriginal stories that have been collected by other people, as far as I can see, is that mostly they seem to be implying that there are 5 toes. The tracks being bigger, of course. Mm-hmm. But and when it comes to non-Aborigines, well, in the colonial era, there are just a few cases where people actually looked at the feet while they were busy having the daylight scared out of them by moving these things. A couple of them actually had this presence of mind to look at the feet. And in one case, the surveyor who had, some time, perhaps a minute or so while the thing was standing by his campfire, he said that the toes were very long in proportion to the rest of the foot.
There's just general dispute about the situation with the feet. No one can really get a read on the number of toes, and even some of the Aboriginal legend says that the yowie had backwards feet, which is even stranger.
Yeah, that is strange. Of course, it's a belief that exists in hairy man lore outside of Australia too. Mm-hmm. In the Himalayas, the Sherpas and other tribespeople often say that the Yeti's feet are reversed on its ankles, so that that it would baffle people trying to track it. In the Malay Peninsula, people told me this: the Orang Asli, the Aborigines down there, believe that the Orang Mawas or Orang Hitam, its feet are reversed on its ankles. And even bizarrely, in Andros Island in the Bahamas, when I was there in 1979, investigating stories of the Yaho, the kind of medium foot, small Bigfoot type thing that's been reported there, the local people said, well, if you go down there looking for those things and you see the tracks going one way, you go the other way because the feet are reversed on the ankle.
Yeah.
So it's a funny thing, and it certainly crops up. It was recorded, that belief was recorded many times, up to, as far as I can gather, the 1940s or 50s or so in Australia. It was recorded many times. But I must say that in the modern era, when I've been interviewing Aborigines, I've never been told that by Aborigines myself. But it is a weird thing. Neil Frost, he says, well, maybe they, when confronted with a huge animal that they were frightened of and that was notoriously difficult to track, perhaps Aborigines pulled this idea of the reversed foot syndrome out of the air to sort of more or less explain why they couldn't catch these creatures.
Yeah. And one of the great things about the book, Yowie in Search of Australia's Bigfoot, that you and Paul Cropper co-wrote, I mean, you really synthesize a lot of the case reports and break it down in a chapter with a lot of graphs and charts, and I appreciate that a lot, too, because it's not just like, here's a bunch of case sightings. It's like we took case sightings and actually did something with them and tried to come to some kind of conclusions and figure out maybe trends and that sort of thing. So kudos to you and Paul for that for that chapter in the book.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Tim. Yeah. Yes, it was a lot of work, that, and I hope we made some kind of sense out of it. We got some of those graphs surprised us, actually. We found that they actually, if you look at them, I guess from an impartial point of view, they do tend to suggest that this phenomenon is much more than hallucination or just mere folklore, because if people were imagining or hallucinating these encounters with yowies, then you would think that they would see them nearly always at night.
Yeah.
And that there would be a solitary human witness. But in fact, that's not the case. There are 115 cases where there are more than one witness. In some cases, many witnesses at the one time. And there are basically almost the same number of sightings in daylight hours as at night, although, of course, there are many, many more people around during the daytime than at night. Interestingly, though, from dawn through to about 10 or 11 a.m., there are very few, relatively very few sightings. The sightings pick up around 10 or 11 a.m. and increase through to dusk, and then carry on through till midnight and the very early hours of the morning, and then drop away to almost nothing towards dawn. So there is a pattern. There's a real pattern there. And the other unexpected thing was that there are many fewer sightings in summer than in the other seasons, which is very strange because, as in North America, I guess, there are many, many more humans wandering around the forests in summer than there are in winter and so on. We have our school holidays in summer, and families have these four-wheel drives and so on. So, but there are discernibly fewer sightings in summer than the other seasons. So, yeah, quite a few interesting things were thrown up.
Yeah. And then another interesting creature that you discuss in the book that is not the yowie but is maybe somewhat related to the yowie is the and let me make sure I pronounce this right, the Junjidi, right?
Junjidi. Junjidi.
The Junjidi.
Yes. Well, that is pretty strange. After we'd been researching the yowie for some years, trying to accumulate information to prove that there were these big, hairy, Yeti-like things, Sasquatch-like things in Australia, we started to collect stories of very small, hairy, man-like or ape-like creatures, about 3 feet tall. And at first we thought, well, obviously these things must be juvenile yowies. But we started to notice that, well, for one thing, they weren't seen with adult yowies like big hairy men or big hairy women. And also we learned very early on that Aborigines, many different groups of Aborigines, I'm not saying every Aboriginal group in Australia because I don't know, but many Aboriginal groups believe that there are 2 different types of hairy sort of subhumans in Australia. That's not counting Europeans. They say that there are the big hairy men, doolagals, gubba, jarrawara. They have many names for the big fellows, as they call them. But they say that there is this distinctly different type called Junjidi, or there are many variations on the word Junjidi and other terms in different areas like Nimbin and Winnembu and so on. So they say there are different types. Well, some researchers say, oh well, you know, the Aborigines just don't know what they're talking about. We couldn't possibly have two different types of undiscovered ape-like men running around in Australia. The little fellas must be the offspring of the big ones. But I think that it's foolish to disrespect or disregard centuries or thousands of years of Aboriginal law. So we just kept an open mind for a long time on that. By the time we got around to writing this book, though, we thought, well, perhaps the Aborigines are right, because there are certain things you've got to consider. As I said, these little hairy men are not seen usually, or virtually never at all, with the bigger ones. They're often seen in groups, well, in pairs or 3 or 4 together, all small. They are, and they're seen by Europeans as well as Aborigines. So there may be some other aspects which are slipping my mind right now, but there are some a few considerations. So we devoted a separate chapter to the Junjidi in this book, and one thing that perhaps could have some bearing on this is the recent discovery of small Junjidi-sized skeletons on Flores, the island in Indonesia, which is 700 kilometres, what's that, about 400, 500 miles north of Australia. They were discovered in 2004, as you probably know. The small skeletons, which they call these people Homo floresiensis, the hobbits, and they have long arms. Their teeth are very big in comparison to their skulls. They're 3 feet tall. The present human inhabitants of Flores say that these creatures existed until 200 or 300 years ago, and according to tribal law were covered from head to toe in hair. So although there are no relics of Junjidi-sized humans in Australia, Flores is pretty damn close to Australia, really, and in the Ice Age, when the sea levels were much lower, it's quite feasible that they could have found their way to Australia. In fact, Mike Morwood, the scientist who was leader of the party that found this skeleton, he says he wouldn't be at all surprised. In fact, he would be surprised if these creatures didn't get to Australia. His theory, which he may be modifying a little at the moment, but at the time we wrote the book, his theory was that these small creatures on Flores were the descendants of Homo erectus, which were human-sized or larger creatures, Java man. The Homo erectus got to Flores 850,000 years ago, and then that's the last we know of them. But Mike Morwood and his crew speculated that finding themselves isolated on this small island, they, over 800,000 years, shrank to the size of hobbits because elephants that were also on the island also shrank to the size of water buffaloes or cows. So one theory that we just float, we put it out there in the book, is that we say, well, Mike Morwood says that the little hairy Homo floresiensis probably got to Australia. He also says that he would be very surprised if Homo erectus, the full-sized ancestor of the hobbits, he'd be very surprised if Homo erectus did not also get to Australia. Well, whereas the Homo erectus that stayed on Flores shrank, the ones that got to Australia could have increased in size, like some Homo erectus relatives did on mainland Asia. Mm-hmm. They grew in size. The ones that got to Australia would have been presented with this vast sort of feast of megafauna lumbering around everywhere, just begging to be slaughtered on the largest island on Earth, Australia. So they could have grown in size and become, shall we suggest, the Yowie. Later on, some of their smaller relations, the Homo floresiensis, could have got to Australia and become the Jungidae. Well, this is just an idea we put forward. It's one of the it's the best. If you want to believe the Yowies and the Jungidaes are flesh and blood, they have to come from somewhere, and this is as good a suggestion as we can think of.
Yeah, the Jungidae chapter is amazing. It's an awesome addition to the book. I'm glad you guys decided to put it in there. It sounded like you were debating it for a little bit, but then decided, we got to include the Jungidae, and I'm glad you did because the chapter is awesome, and we just scratched the surface here on the Jungidae mystery.
Yeah, glad you liked it.
And then, sort of heading towards the big picture here, you guys come up with 4 conclusions on what the Yowie might be, and I'm amused by the way you listed them because you have A, B, and C, and then X. And A being not real. And we really don't need to discuss that because the evidence seems to point to not real. Well, actually, why don't you just talk about each of them and how you sort of dismiss some and agree with some and all that good stuff. The choices are not real, real but extinct, and then way down the list here at X is paranormal. And you guys seem to say that you probably don't think it's A or C, being not real or real but extinct. And you and Paul have your own sort of friendly disagreement on whether it's real or real and paranormal. So talk about sort of in all your years here of Yowie research, what do you think it's all about, and why do you think the other options aren't it?
Well, yes, let me see. That was a fairly good summary of what, yes. Well, I think it's possible for skeptics to make a fairly reasonable case to argue that the creatures have never existed at all, and that they are just an amalgam of Aboriginal myth, European superstition, mass hallucination, misidentification of feral human beings wandering around, hermits and so on, and just fear of the great unknown in Australia. Other aspects like that, or hoaxes as well. There have been 1 or 2 hoaxes, not very clever ones, but there was one that fooled some people for some time. So it is possible for a skeptic to make a reasonable case. Certainly they could convince themselves these things don't exist. But you can demolish that case. You can argue against that case quite convincingly. If humans are hallucinating when they see these creatures, then their livestock, their horses and their dogs and other animals are also hallucinating because almost universally dogs and horses get extremely freaked out by the presence of Yowies. So, I mean, if Australian animals, like their benighted masters, also hallucinating, there are many other ways that you can address that suggestion that never existed. The uniformity of the descriptions and so on is one thing. That there are many other ways, and of course, eyewitnesses get extremely irate they say, look, there were 6 of us. How in the hell could we have all hallucinated it? And many people, several, like half a dozen at least or more, people specifically said that they'd never heard of the Yowie. Well, many more actually said that, but half a dozen were new migrants to Australia who'd never even heard of the wildest suggestion that there could have been such a thing here. So, that's the first thing, as you say, we tend to say, well, no, you can't argue that these things never existed. They must exist in some way.
Yeah, and you really don't even have to go into the argument that they're real, because that's the book in itself. I mean, the book is the argument that they're real. So, all the evidence.
Yowie nests, that's one thing. The discovery of these like primate nests, that's one thing that's quite physical, as well as the plaster caster footprints and so on. You were leading on there to
the real but extinct. I guess we really almost don't even have to discuss this, because we're talking about Yowie sightings that have occurred in the last few years and stuff. So obviously the extinct argument sort of goes out the window with the not real. So let's talk about the paranormal aspect of the Yowie, because that sounds like the fly in the ointment to the Yowie mystery in some ways.
Yes, that's right. As you intimated before, Paul Cropper and I we have agreed to more or less disagree on this point. I'm much more inclined to believe that these things are in some way uncanny or supernatural than Paul is. Mind you, I hope I'm wrong. I hope that they're just big, sort of Homo erectus or Java man lumbering around out there, and that one day we'll get a perfect photograph and so on. But there are, there's quite a galaxy of reasons actually, and many reasons why I think that there is possibly something paranormal about these things. I think it's because my focus has been very broad over the years. I've looked for Yeti-like creatures in 5 different countries, and I've noticed that there are various aspects that keep recurring in the attitude of the witnesses, in the attitude of the skeptics, even in the reactions of animals, I'll start to lose my thread here. One thing is that I have noticed this, and this takes some explaining, I think. I've noticed that areas that produce a lot of Yowie or Sasquatch reports also produce a lot of other strange reports, like reports of uncatchable black panthers, for instance. Mm-hmm. That's the most common. Or if you happen to be near a body of water, there are likely to be stories of people seeing strange water monsters, like up at Lake Okanagan, for instance. And also quite frequently reports of unidentified flying object or light. Also, occasionally, poltergeist phenomena, like rocks sort of being flicked or thrown around, or even showering on one residence that was visited by a Yowie, like so many pebbles falling that it sounded like a hailstorm. That's pretty odd.
Yeah.
The way the creature's eyes at night appear to glow without any ambient light to reflect. They just appear to glow as if lit from within. Many witnesses in North America and in Australia have reported this, and it takes some explaining at least. Other things are the incredible intense level of fear that many people experience when they see these creatures. Now, I've seen bears close up, and you get quite a fright. Any large animal that you encounter can give you a bit of a fright, but the level of fear that people experience seems to be way out of proportion to their experience. Several people, and I'm talking 10 or so of our witnesses, or 12 or more, say that they'll never go into the Australian bush again.
Wow.
Unarmed, or if they go in there, they won't stay very long, or if they go into the bush, they feel extremely uneasy and they have to come back out again. All because they saw a yowie 20 or 15 or 20 years earlier. And others say that they have nightmares, recurring nightmares. Women who we've interviewed have burst into tears talking about it. It's something odd. I think it's quite significant. There are many other aspects too that we list in the book.
Exactly.
I don't want to go on endlessly.
And one side question here I wanted to ask you is, being Australian, obviously, and the famous Australian, I guess he was a naturalist or an animal researcher, Steve Irwin. Did Steve Irwin ever talk about the yowie or mention the yowie in Australia?
Not that I know of. Steve was based in Queensland, and poor old Steve, I mean, what a hero, a great guy. I was a real fan, and I had been past his Australia Zoo complex on a couple of occasions. There are yowie reports within rifle shot of that establishment. I'd be very surprised if he never mentioned a yowie. No, but as far as I know, no. However, I was, at the time of his death, I was planning to take this book, our new book, up there and see if I could get him to at least market it for us. But there was a fellow prior to Steve, the best-known Australian bushman was Major Les Hiddens, who was known as the Bush Tucker Man. Mm-hmm. That is, he was the army expert on survival in the Australian bush, and tucker is the Australian slang term for food. So he was the bush food man, and he wrote books and guides on how to survive in the bush, and very well-known man in Australia. I've talked to him in recent months, and he is a yowie enthusiast now. He's setting out camera traps in the jungle in North Queensland, because so many of his army colleagues had seen yowies.
Huh.
And he also found a classic primate nest up there. And when he was guiding a party of 6 leading scientists through the jungle, it was a classic find, because one of the scientists had recently returned from Africa. And he said, "My God, if I was in Africa, I'd say that was definitely a primate nest." So, yeah, unfortunately, poor old Steve is dead. But, yeah.
I didn't mean to be depressing. I just figured...
Oh, no. I mean, he had a great life. I mean, he cheered up. He still cheers a lot of people up.
Oh, I'm sure. I just figured since he was in Australia-based and everything, maybe it would have come up in one of his appearances or something, but I guess it didn't.
We should have, obviously, if we'd have known he was going to... I guess we always had that on the back burner. Or one of these days we must go and ask Steve Irwin if he knows anything about this.
Yeah. All right. Well, so what's next for you, Tony? Last I talked, when we were setting up the interview here by email, you said you were heading to America. So that's probably what you're going to tell us now. But what's next for you? What's on your plate here in the future in 2007 for Tony Healy?
Well, yes, it's mainly the trip to America. That'll be 7 months of this year, from late April to mid-November. It's just something. I guess I felt like a bit of a change after so many years of putting this book together with Paul. it's got almost to the stage where I don't want to hear another Yowie report. But and I'm not getting any younger, as I mentioned. So I thought, well, it might be time for one last big road trip in North America, the US and Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got some good friends over there from my Bigfoot hunting days in 1978, 79. I think I better go and see them before they all drop dead. So I'm looking forward to catching up with all of them. And I'm scheduled to also speak at a Bigfoot conference, Don Keating's Tri-State Bigfoot Conference in Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
In I think it's from the 22nd of October. 22nd of May. Sorry, that's 21st to 22nd of May, 07. So I'll be speaking about the Yowie there, and then I'll be spending many months touring around, visiting, as I said, old friends and catching up with people that I have I know through the email and so on, and visiting all the Yowie Bigfoot hotspots, and also visiting several of those monster haunted lakes, which Lake Okanagan, Lake Champlain, and so on. I'm really looking forward to it. It'll be a bit of a Rip Van Winkle experience. Almost 30 years. I was a young man when I was over there last, and the Bigfoot research has moved on. There's been new discoveries and new theories and new people involved. So I'm really looking forward to it. I mean, the USA is just always such great value. It's a great adventure for me.
Awesome.
So
awesome.
I'm looking forward to seeing you over there.
Yes. When you alluded to being in Boston, so when you do come around my neighborhood, we'll definitely have to meet up. Sounds like you're going to have quite an adventure here in America.
I hope so, mate. I hope so. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, Tony. I really appreciate it, especially being all the way in Australia. Just to set it all up and everything was quite a challenge, but I'm glad we got it all taken care of, and I'm glad you came on the show. The book, which you co-wrote with Paul Cropper, is The Yowie, In Search of Australia's Bigfoot. I cannot talk about how great this book is enough. I can't put it over enough. Not only do you get the history of the Yowie in Australia, but you're also going to get discussion on the hotspots of the Yowie, discussion on the Junjidi, amazing analysis on all these different cases, and look at some of the trends of the Yowie, and various conclusions on what the Yowie might be, and an amazing appendix, 100-page appendix, folks. 300 sightings in there, 282 cases, and 120 eyewitnesses. So Paul and Tony aren't just, putting in 2 cases and then saying, here's the Yowie mystery. You got a whole bunch of cases in there to take a look at and to examine for yourself to find out more about the Yowie mystery. It's just jam-packed and an amazing book that I enjoyed tremendously. So kudos to you and Paul on the tremendous job, and hopefully the Binnall of America audio audience will pick it up and read it. And they can find the book at Amazon.com, of course, and AnomalistBooks.com. Either one of those sites will get you on the road to picking up Yowie in Search of Australia's Bigfoot. And they can find out more information on you, of course, at YowieFile.com, YOWIEFILE.com. Tony Healy, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure for me too, Tim. Thanks a lot. And I wish every interviewer was as well read as you are. I mean, you obviously read the book very thoroughly and understood it. So it's great to know you appreciated it. I look forward to seeing you in Boston.
Awesome. There you have it, folks. That does it for this week's edition of Binnall of America Audio. Big thanks to Tony Healy for coming on the show all the way from Australia. It took me a little while to get the logistics lined up for this interview, but we managed to get it done with help from Tony Healy, so big thanks to him again for coming on the show. You can find out more information on him and the book at www.yowiefile.com, YOWIEFILE.com, yowiefile.com. Check it out, and check out the book. Tony Healy, Paul Cropper, co-authors of The Yowie, In Search of Australia's Bigfoot. I can't recommend it enough. Just an outstanding piece of work. Before we dive into the mailbag, let's take care of some in-house notes. For starters, over the break, when we recorded the new interviews, we tried to do it a little bit differently. We got some advice from people who have been listening to the show, who work in the audio field, made some suggestions. Hopefully the audio will sound a little bit better than previous episodes, those of you who are audiophiles and connoisseurs of good sound. In addition to that, we realized that the BOA computer, which was fixed over the break, had been set at a lower internet speed, and as such we realized that we have been underestimating the power of people's download speeds, so we're going to up the bit rate of the MP3s now, so that hopefully the quality will be improved a little more from that as well. And in addition to that, we even got the mysterious voiceover man back in the studio to tape a new introduction to the program so we could get rid of those pops that a lot of people had been complaining about in the introduction. The pops are gone, and I think the way we had the introduction will be how it rolls from here on out. So there you go. We made some improvements to the program here over the break. Hopefully you'll notice them. Moving right along now, of course, it's time for the Binnall of America Audio listener feedback. And this week's letter comes from Timothy Green Beckley in New York City, and here's what he has to say. Regarding your conversation with Greg Bishop pertaining to blacks in ufology. There are blacks in ufology. Bob Urich used to come to almost all my conferences in San Diego and Phoenix, and has even organized conferences in his hometown on Philadelphia. Let's not forget Barney Hill. Can't we count him if we consider that Betty Hill was a UFO author and spoke at many meetings? I can't think of the guy's name, but there is a black contactee from Brooklyn who has been on Howard Stern's show more than once or twice. There was up till recently a show on Time Warner Public Access here in New York City that came on at 2 a.m. and consisted of lectures by various black researchers. Most of it was conspiracy, but they did talk about ancient astronauts and government cover-up of UFOs. One of my favorite sightings involved a buffalo hunter, a black gentleman, who while out one afternoon encountered a landed saucer complete with alien who grabbed his shotgun and bent the sucker like Uri Geller would. The photo was in all the papers. This would have been back in the 1960s. And most importantly of all, Muhammad Ali, who I visited with numerous times at his home and training camp, claimed to have had over 20 UFO sightings, backed up by his trainers and other witnesses. I reported that for the Inquirer and in my book, UFO Among the Stars. Barbara Hudson lived in Harlem. She was a part of Jim Mosley's group and a good friend of mine. She knew Adamski and claimed to have had numerous UFO contacts with the group claiming they were aliens. UFOs cut across every cultural group, my friend. Keep up the good work. The show is always interesting. Timothy Green Beckley. There you go, folks, an answer to the question that we were pondering with Greg Bishop on the Binnall of America Audio Baseball Special, Blacks in Ufology. Timothy Green Beckley, thank you for sending that great information. There's a whole bunch of blacks in ufology that we hadn't discussed yet. Interesting stuff there on Muhammad Ali, and awesome information. So that is the power of BOA Audio. We ponder the question and we get the answers, not just from the guests, but from the listeners. Thanks again for writing in, Timothy. If you'd like to be a part of Binnall of America Audio listener feedback, there's two ways to do it. A, go to binnallofamerica.com, click the contact button in the top right-hand corner of the screen. That will take you to the contact page that has all the information. Or simply write to boaaudio@hotmail.com, boaaudio@hotmail.com. Either one of those methods will put your correspondence on the road to being featured here on Binnall of America Audio listener feedback. Up next, of course, is the thanks. Big thanks to the fantastic binnallofamerica.com staff, Leslie, Chiron, R. Lee, Joe V., Ralph Molesworth, and Tina Senna, for your help and support with the audio series and the website. I also want to throw in a big, huge congratulations to Leslie and R. Lee, the two newest columnists at UFO Magazine. Leslie and R. Lee are now a part of the UFO Magazine, writing monthly columns. As I've been saying, week in and week out here on the program, they are writing some amazing stuff, and I'm thrilled that it's not gone unnoticed by the powers that be in the world of esoterica. Congratulations to Leslie and R. Lee. I look forward to reading their monthly columns in UFO Magazine. You, the great Binnall of America Audio listeners, should be checking out their columns at binnallofamerica.com, along with the fantastic columns of Chiron, Tina Senna, and Joe V. BOA is not just a weekly audio show. It is esoterica, day in, day out, fresh stuff at BOA. Check out what we have to offer at binnallofamerica.com and make it a part of your everyday search for esoteric news and opinion. If you're a long-time BOA audio listener or an appreciative newcomer and you want to help support the audio series, you simply go to binnallofamerica.com, click the PayPal button, and make a donation. What you have just listened to this week was part of a 2-hour phone call to Australia. Folks, that kind of thing doesn't pay for itself. I pay for the 2-hour phone call to Australia with help from Binnall of America audio listeners. If you can make donations, then we can do crazy stuff like this and do great international episodes. We're not a big radio conglomerate. We're a ragtag operation, and we are fueled by the great listeners like you. So, click the PayPal button, make a donation, and help BOA Audio grow and evolve. Next week on the program, we're going to get exopolitical with Dr. Michael Sala, one of the big movers and shakers in the exopolitical field. You've heard many people on the program talk about exopolitics, some pro, some con. Next week, we're going to bring one of the gurus of the exopolitical movement, Dr. Michael Sala, on the program to talk about what is exopolitics, response to the critics of the movement, his thoughts on big UFO stories of the past year, Symington, the French UFO documents, all that stuff. It's going to be an exopolitical, ufological bonanza next week with Dr. Michael Sala. Check out BOA on Friday for the preview of next week's episode. And on that note, we call it a week. It's great to be back. Thanks for listening, folks. You'll be hearing from me next week. Until then, this is Tim Binnall, signing off.